हमारे अजदाद आबा ये कहते थे और आप अपने आप को कौन समझते हैं? And frankly, the answer is कोई नहीं. I am nobody. But you give me a better solution. Our next generation is searching for that identity. They have unanswered questions, right? And these questions are not solved by reading Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah.
There is Iqamat-e-Deen of Maulana Maududi. There is Muttahida Qawmiyat of Hussain Ahmad Madni. Allama Iqbal understanding the federal structure through which we can have pockets of distributed strategies. And then Maulana Azad moving from Khilafat movement to completely secularizing Islam in the constitutional framework.
I believe a diversity is needed and healthy. And I believe it becomes problematic when people on this diversity don't understand the need for this diversity.
For me, as a student of politics, Makkah and Medina were city-states. And they were micro versions of global nation states. All of those attributes in a micro sense for me exists.
The constitution of Medina of the Prophet ﷺ literally enshrined political and legal rights to every one of these mini federations. And the Quran itself says, let the people of the Torah judge by the Torah, let the people of the Injil judge by the Injil.
So even that same ontological overlap in intuition and understanding leads to different societal constructs. So theology is outside the system. The Wahi is the perfect claim of what this system intends to.
You cannot micromanage and control the entire society. The goal is overall a society that is conducive of the flourishing of morality, where public indecency is kept to a minimal level.
How do you see the work of Hallaq? Because it's very popular in the sense that a lot of young Muslims take it as the foundational way we should address our interaction with the Western epistemology.
Surely we understand that when it comes to defining the theology and the legality of Islamic rulings, surely the clerical class as a whole should be given some precedence over others.
Are these specializations of understanding the text, and whether in the future do we need a larger metaphysical paradigm which is able to deal with these nuances epistemologically speaking, methodologically speaking? Is that an aim? Today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Yasir Qadhi. Dr. Yasir Qadhi has been at the forefront of the Muslim identity crisis, not just in the world, globally speaking, in the sense कि जो हम problems face कर रहे हैं as a civilization, what does it mean to be a Muslim in a context, in a setting which supposedly alienates us, in a world which is dominated by global Islamophobia, जिसकी लोकल सेटिंग्स हैं, वो जिसका इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, जिसका अरबिक कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, जिसका वेस्टर्न कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, जिसका यूरोपियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट है, उस वक्त हम जैसे नौजवान जिस प्रॉब्लम से गुजर रहे हैं वो क्राइसिस आइडेंटिटी की है. मैं कौन हूँ, व्हाट कैन आई कंट्रीब्यूट, व्हाट आई हैव टू ऑफर, ये जो मेरा फेथ है क्या वो होलिस्टिक इनफ है, कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव इनफ है वर्ल्ड की प्रॉब्लम्स को डील करने के लिए. It is in that setting Dr. Yasir Qadhi brings Islamic discourse, politically speaking, from the perspective of society, from the perspective of dawah, from the perspective of theology. जो distinctions, जो differences पिछले 100-200 साल में especially in the national context reproduce हो गए, जो उतने ज़्यादा शायद होते भी नहीं because of the artificiality of conditions that were produced. So Dr. Yasir Qadhi, usually I see कि आप you also make शुरू में जो आपने जब ये सफ़र आपका शुरू हुआ, when you were really questioning the axiomatic frameworks, first principles के level पे जब rethink करना कि क्या ये जो positions हम ले रहे हैं, क्या ये positions baggage हैं, sufficiently Islamic हैं, rooted हैं, क्या ये हमें grounding दे रहे हैं. So I think that is where you have contributed, alhamdulillah. तो लेकिन ये journey है. This is something you've achieved over a lifetime. वो जर्नी हम समझना चाहेंगे कि आपका बचपन क्या था, how were you raised, in what setting, what was, क्योंकि being raised in a Muslim Islamic family as well, I see it not as this generation's problem. It is at least a few generations problem which is culminating into bigger and bigger and bigger issues. What were the issues you were facing when you were growing up? What were your challenges? What were your questions?
Firstly, appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and your tour to America to come and interview me. Secondly, may Allah forgive you for the praise that you gave. I don't think I am worthy of it. And also, I have said multiple times, and by the way, of course, my जैसे मैं कहता हूँ मेरी मादरी ज़बान अंग्रेज़ी है और मेरी माँ की ज़बान उर्दू हिंदी है. Okay, so I will prefer to speak in English, लेकिन कोई बात नहीं, ज़रा अल्फाज भी हम उर्दू हिंदी में कह देंगे यहाँ वहाँ ताकि ज़रा सा कुछ फेमिलियरिटी हो जाए कि मैं भी जो है आप लोग के एथनिक बैकग्राउंड से हूँ. लेकिन एज यू नो मैं पैदा यहीं हुआ, रहाइश यहीं हुए, तो इंग्लिश इज़ माई priority language. So actually, just to make a brief, if you like, semi-defense and clarification, I was forced to consider the political issues post 9/11. It was not my area of interest or passion or expertise, and it still is not my area of expertise. ये तो बस, circumstances की वजह से, we had to, like, for me, 9/11 was a personal transformation. Okay, pre 9/11, I was extremely apolitical, extremely involved in abstract theology and, fiqh and whatnot, and I thought that was my identity. And I was, 25 years old when 9/11 happened, so I was a young man. And seeing the world change, seeing my country change, seeing the Islamophobia rise in a way that I had never expected, right? And realizing that this is a new era and our rights are being taken away, institutions shut down, people being deported, going to jail, people that I knew, my institutions that I knew. And हम लोग यहाँ बैठ के कुछ नहीं vision plan है, क्या कर सकते हैं? This is what forced me. And then us journey mein bas one thing leads to another, here I find myself. So for the record, my PhD is not in political theory, but I've been forced to study at an amateur level, and I'm not qualified to do that. But koi aur kar raha nahi, hum kya kare? I mean, what is to be done when, frustratingly, so many of our leaders and clerics, I am not satisfied with what they're doing in trying to solve the problems of our youth. And I'm just trying my best to, eke out, not just an existence, but a sense of izzah and glory and pride for the next generation. जो solutions उनके पास नहीं है. So this is what has forced me to, undertake this track and journey. जो आप कह रहे हैं, questions of identity. So our next generation is searching for that identity. They have unanswered questions, right? And these questions are not solved by reading Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah. Yeah. They're not solved by Fakhruddin al-Razi and al-Tabari and Fulan and Allan. These are modern questions. So unke iman ke liye, mere khud bachon ke liye, I'm saying, my own children are no longer children, they're young men and women. For them and for their generation, I've been forced to not only expand my horizons, but to rethink through. I don't like doing this. I don't like having to go back and reinvent the wheel where people thought the wheel is completely perfect, and to realize actually it's not perfect. It's not a nice thing to come to that conclusion. It's not, because obviously then what happens is the challenges start happening from those that believe their inherited wheel is perfect. Bhai, aap kaun hai? आप कौन अपने आप को समझते हैं? This is the constant, threat and challenge that I get कि हमारे अजदाद आबा ये कहते थे और आप अपने आप को कौन समझते हैं? And frankly, the answer is कोई नहीं. I am nobody. But you give me a better solution. I have always said to my, critics that are open-minded, bhai, theek hai, I'm a human being, but tell me, what are we supposed to do now? I am fallible in my ideas. Like in the end of the day, balancing all of these different competing narratives, trying to make sense of our inherited epistemological, baggage, along with the modern political issues, along with the modern identity crises. Bhai, theek hai, if you don't agree with me, no problem. Give me a better solution, and I'll be the first to follow. So, just to make the clarification, this is not something that I enjoyed doing, nor even intended to go do. Lekin, just it is what it is, and one thing leads to another. And I constantly ask Allah for hidayah, for ikhlas, for guiding me in this very perplexing, situation. And I'm more than happy to hear from those that are better experts than me. And inshallah, we'll benefit together in this conversation, inshallah.
Sure. So, Dr. Qadhi, when you were here in America, when you were 25, you decided to shift your focus in terms of your academics. You had done chemical engineering, and then you decided to go back to Saudi Arabia to read Islamic studies, to do Islamic studies. So when you talk about these imperfections, in a sense, which were not solving your questions of identity, which was not giving you grounding enough to be confidently talking about these issues out aloud in front of people who are not Muslims, who are young people who are Muslims also, young people, but they have engaged enough with the Western civilization. What were those challenges? What were you facing? What was the system that you took inherently in the form of your training and academics in Saudi Arabia?
So again, clarification. I went to Medina pre 9/11, and I was studying in Medina when 9/11 happened.
Yes.
So my earlier phase was a simplistic puritanical phase, where as a teenager in the early 90s, I felt that the various Islamic movements, my father was a part of Jamaat Islami, my father was one of the founders of Jamaat Islami in this part of the world, and so I grew up in that Jamaat Islami background. When the Salafi da'wah at the time came, obviously its emphasis on the texts, its emphasis on the tradition is very alluring. And there's a sense of authenticity, or I should say pseudo-authenticity, that comes with that type of rhetoric, right? And I was swept up in the innocent early days of the early 90s. I was swept up in the sense and the notion that this is real Islam, right? And that illusion is fully understandable, because when you connect a person to a tradition that they believe is quite ancient and authoritarian, when you connect when you connect a young mind to textbooks that go back 1,000 years, to minds that automatically there's this romanticization, right? A simplistic romanticization of a utopic, idealistic past, and of great giants of the ulama, talking about the relevant issues that you feel are relevant, even though as you grow older you realize they're not relevant. But khair. So I went through that phase, and that was when I decided I don't want to be a chemical engineer. Even if I have a degree, I have a job, I don't want that, because I didn't find personal satisfaction, and I really wanted to study my religion. And so I, at that time gave up my career in Dow Chemical and went to study at University of Medina, went to the College of Hadith, and then got into the Master's MA in Theology, and that was when 9/11 happened. So that phase of my life, I was studying the tradition from a particular paradigm and perspective, and I'm very thankful for that phase. I wouldn't be who I am without that phase. But as I said, when 9/11 happened, at that phase, questions began to come to me. Okay, what is the way forward? And I was looking for answers amongst the scholars that I looked up to. And with respect, I say I didn't find those answers. In fact, I'm not trying to be harsh. I have never once criticized any particular scholar, but not only that, I began to realize that the people I'm looking up to are not even qualified. This is a realization. When you're a young man, you idealize certain groups of people, right? When you're in your early 20s, it's totally natural, mid-20s even, you will consider certain people to be the end-all and be-all. As you grow older and you start quizzing and teasing and interrogating, and you realize, hold on a sec, they are not able to benefit me. In fact, it could even be said they are disconnected from the reality that I am living. And that realization is terrifying and humbling and frightening, because what do you do now? The people that you looked up to, thinking that they have all the answers, now you realize, well, that was because the questions you asked them were within a very small, narrow issue of abstract issues of theology, abstract issues of fiqh, right? What does it mean to be a Muslim in post 9/11 America? None of my teachers can help me out there, right? And what do you do then when you realize, actually, who do you turn to? Where do you get this concrete way forward? And this is one of the incentives that I realized, actually, I need to start studying more than just one tradition. And that realization that there's so many other aspects of ilm that I'm not yet familiar with is what prompted me to finish my master's in Medina and then to return to America for the PhD. I was never pre 9/11 thinking of returning to America for studies, maybe even returning to America permanently, because again, that was an innocent phase of idealism that Darul Islam and Darul Kufr is taught to you. And then you realize there is no Darul Islam and Darul Kufr in the technical sense, right? Again, you need to come to this realization on your own. So 9/11 prompted me to, it humbled me to realize that ilm is infinite and no one person will master all ilm. And there is much ilm out there that I need to study in order to be effective for my community. So this is what prompted me to come back to America. I knew I didn't know what I didn't know. Does that make sense? Yeah. I knew I didn't know. And I was willing to learn what I didn't know, but I didn't know what even I wanted to learn. I just knew there's so much more to learn.
It's very Socratic what you say.
If you want to put it that way, okay.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. I didn't intend it that way, but I see what you're saying. In other words, let me be, again, very frank here. And one of my problems is I'm a bit too blunt, and in that bluntness, it comes across sometimes as arrogance or as harshness. May Allah forgive me, that's not the intent, but I'm not a politician. I don't mince my words. The point is to get the message across. Frankly speaking, pre 9/11, I felt my trend and my scholarship and my bubble was all I needed. And I felt any ilm outside that bubble was useless to me. That was the point. I didn't need that ilm.
That trend is, we observe it all the time. Even
I understand it. Yeah. I understand it. That's what I'm saying. I'm sympathetic to it because I know exactly how I felt. Yeah. The level of, and it is a type of complex. It's a type of superiority complex where you feel your group and your ulama and your tradition has all the answers, right? It was the political changing of the world and the realization that my group doesn't have the answers, right? That humbled me to understand, actually, there's knowledge that I need, and it is not found in my tradition and my seminary and my university. And it is knowledge that is essential to survive.
Dr. Qadhi, that leads to a bigger question that we often face. One that I myself, when I was trying to understand the problems that we are facing, I thought that we're facing we should be able to distinguish between tradition and traditionalism. Mm-hmm. So what we end up doing is, at a certain point of history, the way the tradition was interpreted and organized and reflected upon and articulated, what we're defending ultimately is that project.
Yeah.
And the second question that comes to me is the hegemonization of learning of Islam itself, whether it should come only through a procedure or a process, or if somebody who might not have been trained for a certain period of time in, let's say, a seminary, and then he decides or she decides to look back, read all of those texts, and still somebody tells you that you're not qualified enough to talk about that. So for me, it is a reflection of some economist and a political theorist who tells an ulama, you're not qualified to talk about these world issues. It creates a kind of dichotomy.
Yeah, so this is one of the big challenges we're facing, is that the sheer quantity of specialities and ulum out there is daunting for any one person, right? I am somebody who believes that we need a healthy dialogue between all these specialities to form a solution. The economist in and of himself might not be the best qualified to discuss for a Muslim-friendly audience. He might even be saying correct things, but he doesn't have the mechanism to actually impact a Muslim audience. The scholar might have more impact, but doesn't quite understand the day-to-day nuances of, let's say, the modern economic system. What if we were to enter into a dialogue? What if each one were to humble himself and realize, you know what, this guy knows something I don't know. It's like Musa and Khidr. In the famous hadith of Sahih Bukhari, right? That Khidr says to Musa, Allah has given you ilm I don't have, and Allah has given me ilm you don't have. If people like Musa and Khidr can be that humble, and they are who they are, and they're benefiting from each other, then who am I and you to not benefit from that paradigm? So our scholars are great for what they are trained for. The problem comes, the masses, and I've said this multiple times, the religious folks put the scholars on a pedestal above what they deserve. And the scholars themselves, they don't have internal checks and balances. So generally speaking, most scholars then kind of sort of as a default take that maqam. भाई जब हमसे पूछे हम क्यों नहीं जवाब दें, हमसे पूछें सियासत के बारे में मैं क्यों नहीं अपना सियासी अपना मामला कर लूँ. And the ammi, the average person, doesn't understand when the scholar speaks about fiqh, that is his speciality. When the scholar speaks about political engagement, it is just an opinion, and his opinion is just as good as any other person on the street, and it is not as good as the specialist in siyasa. You see what I'm saying here, right? Yes, the scholar has the right to have a political opinion, सबका हक बनता है, right? Lekin the scholar's opinion about something outside his area of expertise is just as good as any ammi. He becomes an ammi, an average person outside of his area of expertise. But ये कौन समझाएगा लोगों को जब आपने जो है एक बंदे को बना लिया अपने दिमाग में कि ये जो है मुत्तकी है, परहेजगार है, आलिम है, right? And आपने जो है फ़िक़्ह पूछा, माशाल्लाह माशाल्लाह, तफसीर पूछा, वाह वाह वाह, and then आपने पूछा भाई हमारे बीजेपी पार्टी, इसके पार्टी वो पार्टी हम क्या करें, right? मौलाना साहब ने आपको वहीं जवाब दे दिया, and you cannot differentiate fiqh and tafsir and seerah versus political engagement in India, and आपने जो है एक पूरा बना लिया, and then ये उलमा खुद अपने आप को फिर करते रहेंगे, भैया हम भी qualified हैं. You see, it's human nature. And as I said, here in America, experience has taught me that no, I am not an expert in these fields. I have no right to be at the forefront. I only have the right to be in the room and engage in a conversation, right? So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
As I hear you, another question comes to my mind. Is that book by Shihab Ahmed, Who Speaks for Islam? I mean, that's a embedded question as a primary first. It's a question that comes to every Muslim's mind and a non-Muslim's mind. Who can speak for whom? And who can speak for a tradition? And because our Prophet ﷺ's life was holistic enough to be able to impact almost all of what human existence encompasses. So it's a question for me, if you could, in a sense, give some of your remarks. Who can speak for Islam? Even beyond that, can a non-Muslim speak for Islam?
ये आपका जो सवाल है बहुत ही फ़लसफ़ी सवाल है, and frankly इसमें कोई आसान जवाब नहीं है. Firstly, the book that you mentioned is that what is Islam, and that is the whole issue of who can speak for Islam. I actually encourage every aspirant to be an intellectual, every talib al-ilm and every cultured Muslim to engage with that book. I'm not saying to agree, and I'm not praising the book. Exactly. Neither am I disparaging the book.
I totally agree.
It is a book that it is food for thought. If anybody reads it, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
It pushes you to the limit.
It pushes you and it scrambles your brain. It really causes you to think. And in that thought process, you come out a different person. So actually, just a plug here as somebody who, frankly, I have a love-hate relationship with the author, like in the sense, certain things you just want to scream in frustration. Other things you're like, wow, that's a stroke of genius, right? So you know what I'm talking about. Those who know, who know. So that book is a necessary read for those who are aspiring to think outside the box. And for those who aren't, no problem. Do not read it. It's a very confusing book. But the question of who speaks for Islam, firstly, you need to define which version of Islam and which segment of Islam. This is very important, right? Based upon that, then you will begin to formulate an answer. So the average religious-minded, and again, because my background is in clerical studies and because my primary, perception amongst the people is I'm a sheikh or a cleric, the people I most associate with are the masjid-going, parezgar, mashallah, pakke Musalman type of people. If you were to ask them immediately, they think the ulama, right? But that is correct from their paradigm. Obviously, people outside of that paradigm, they are not as enthusiastic to make as ambassadors to the faith those whom they're not admiring in overall holistically. And the fact, and again, even Shihab would say the same thing. Can we even answer this question categorically? Can we even, actually make a definitive claim? There's a circularity in that whoever wishes to speak for segments of the ummah will find those segments willing to take them on as spokesperson. We see this as a lived reality. In the end, I don't think any one person or even one segment can speak authoritatively on behalf of the ummah. Nonetheless, I have to say, as perhaps this is my clerical biases or whatnot, surely we understand that when it comes to defining the theology and the legality of Islamic rulings, surely the clerical class as a whole should be given some precedence over others. So in that area of the definitions of Islam, the definitions of Islamic law, the delineations of what it actually means to be an observant Muslim, surely we can give more credence and more weight to those who have actually trained in the tradition. However, politically speaking, clergy do not speak for Islam, politically speaking. Politics is a whole different field altogether. Socially and culturally speaking, again, this is where the awkward realities come, that some of the most famous, iconic figures associated with the ummah, were not viewed to be representative of the mainstream of the ummah. Simple example is Avicenna ibn Sina. right? We as Muslims culturally love to quote Ibn Sina as an iconic figure that was produced, right? The awkward behind the scenes reality is that no mainstream cleric appreciated Ibn Sina. And people as diverse as Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah both made takfir of Ibn Sina, right? And I mentioned this when I have a library chat about Al-Bayruni, that library chat is meant to show a little bit of that dichotomy. That, okay, so why are we taking pride in Ibn Sina when the people whom the conservative Muslims believe speak for Islam say that Ibn Sina does not speak for Islam? So there are internal contradictions that take place in this regard, right? Who speaks for Islam? There are people that are very popular and famous that don't really, their lifestyle is not Islamic in the religious sense. I don't want to mention names here, but let's just say they're involved in the entertainment industry, right? He or she might be doing things that traditional clerics would begin, yet they might be the most famous icons for Muslim culture in the broader world, right? Influencers in the broader world. And for people outside of the faith, in some weird, bizarre manner, they're actually humanizing the faith and making the faith look good, even though accessible, even though
they're not
one large segment of the ummah, right, would, if not excommunicate them, would be very disparaging against them. So in the end of the day, I am
black and white.
There is no black and white, and there's too many nuances. That who is the segment that you wish is spoken on behalf of, and then what outside audience are you trying to appeal to? So based upon both of these questions, you will find different people speaking on different aspects of the ummah, which is why I cannot answer that question definitively.
So another related question that comes to my mind is the idea of prophethood. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being the perfect abd, the perfect man in a sense, and as a living Quran in a sense, when read in a certain context, he is somebody who's done economics, political theory, politics, war, society, all of these things. Is the scholarly tradition, an alim, trained, or the epistemology or the curriculum sufficient enough to encapsulate the prophetic path?
So obviously the Prophet is considered to be as the insan kamil as much as possible, because obviously insan will always be naqis by nature, right? Meaning that an insan can never become a god. However, within humankind, the greatest manifestation of perfection that is humanly possible is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's no question about that. And yet still, what did he say about himself? He himself said that when the famous issue came of the cross-pollination, because you know your world better than I do. Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum, right? It is as if he is giving almost carte blanche, concession that, hey, listen, I have come to teach you these types of things. In here, there is no question to my authority, but I'm giving you permission. I'm giving you authority to go and discover this dunya and all of the nuances of these different fields here. And this is not, as long as it doesn't conflict with my message. So I actually am a firm believer in this, that the ulama are the inheritors of the prophetic tradition, and the prophetic tradition has itself delineated that it has limits. Meaning, when he told us that, look, this is not, I'm telling you, go and do your research and you follow what you know best. If he said this in his lifetime, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what does that demonstrate for the future? And that's why ulama need to humble themselves, that maybe they're not the best experts in political science, maybe they're not the best experts in economic theory, maybe they're not the best experts in lobbying and in carving out human rights in your country and whatnot, and they need expertise. I would view this as prophetic. I would view this as prophetic, that this is exactly what is intended by our Prophet ﷺ when he told the farmers, you know farming better than I do, you follow your methodology.
One interesting observation that I had when I was looking into, from the philosophical perspective, of course, my training is not in fiqh, my training is not in theology, but I was interested in philosophy. And as a student of philosophy, I was looking into these debates of madhabs and the formation of fiqh and things like that. So the Asari tradition, the Maturidi tradition, these traditions themselves are epistemology, the metaphysical paradigm. Say, for example, when I was looking into the ontological debates of existence within the Vedantic tradition and the Muslim tradition. It's Wahdat al-Wujud, it's Advait, it's Wahdat al-Shuhud, it's Vishisht Advait. It is, there is, Dvaitvad, which is complete dualism. Then there is Achint Bhed Abhed, that there's a possibility of oneness with God, but at a very small scale. That is how you realize God consciousness. So these, for me, in a mathematical sense, were set theories. You have a completely overlapping set. You have a set where there's, some level of intersection. There's a completely mutually exclusive set. There's a set where you're a very small micro set, and there are bigger, there's a holistic bigger set. Similarly, when you see the debates about, the Sufi understanding of Wahdat, it also predominates the philosophy, always predominates the textual interpretation. In my humble opinion, I saw that. Similarly, when I saw the debates about fiqh, for lack of my sufficient knowledge, but the Athari tradition, in a sense, is a very empirical tradition in the sense of literal meaning. And then there is Maturidi tradition, which is trying to be creative enough. So are these specializations of understanding the text, and whether in the future do we need a larger metaphysical paradigm which is able to deal with these nuances epistemologically speaking, methodologically speaking? Is that an aim?
So you bring up a lot of issues to unpack, a lot of issues. Where does one begin? For the record, I just want to state here, this is a much deeper topic, obviously, and I've spoken about this in many, many lectures. And in fact, this is the area that personally I'm the most interested in and I'm directly involved with, and that is dealing with our heritage and tradition as a whole, and what does it mean to be an inheritor of the traditions while understanding these traditions are fallible and human products. Like, how can you respect the tradition without disrespecting it? These are the questions of my time frame. Another key point, I just want to throw it out there. The more you study traditions outside of Islam and predating Islam, the more you find certain parallels in post-Islamic traditions with the pre-Islamic ones. So you brought up, the Vedic understandings of, Wahdat al-Wujud and whatnot, and you find not just a whiff, you find, if not full parallels, you find enough overlap to understand there is some type of causal connection, right? It's not coming out of thin air. And similarly, one of my areas of expertise is the pre-Islamic influences on kalam, right? The Neoplatonic thought and the Hellenistic ideas that came, and the notions of, proving the existence of God via a specific mechanism, and the tasawwur of who God is with the attributes and how it impacted, post-Islamic thought, right? Once you start doing this type of study, you actually realize, and this is my own, could be right and wrong, but it's as if the human mind has a limited room it is engaged in. Yeah. And regardless of whether you're Hindu or Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or whatnot, it's kind of sort of the same questions and metaphysics and epistemologies, but then found in your tradition. I know that sounds almost kufri. I don't mean it at all in that sense. Those who understand, but I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to say the religion of Islam. I'm talking about the post-constructions of the wahi. The wahi that Allah sends down is absolutely unique. That is the shining light. That is the nur.
It's the structure of the human mind.
Exactly. How you engage with the wahi, it's as if there are templates.
Yes.
Right? And you find those templates everywhere.
Yeah.
Now, once you start thinking like this, right, now you realize, okay, then all of these templates are not only fallible, not only man-constructed, but actually extremely contextual and socio-politically, if you like, influenced. And this leads you to basically my current understanding that I'm upon it. I've said this very bluntly, but I need to write about this and explain it more because it causes a lot of confusion. I am not a card-carrying member of any of these epistemologies. I'm not. And the reason being is that I understand personally that these are not epistemologies, these are not methodologies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala required us to follow. On the contrary, there's nothing wrong with them. I'm not anti. I keep on using the phrase moved on, and I do it intentionally. I understand, maybe even admire or respect, but once you understand the fallibility, how then can you stoop down and then be a part of it? Once you understand that, in fact, this mindset, this paradigm, it is found in all of these different traditions, right? So it's literally the battle of the East and the West, the battle of Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy. You find it in Kalam and Tasawwuf.
Exactly.
Quite literally, right? Like in the, I don't want to go down there, but I'm saying the Western philosophical mind, it is analytical. The assumption is that the, logic and reason is going to solve, whereas the Eastern, paradigmatic, the Buddhism and Dharmic and whatnot, it is not, it's about intuition. It's about feeling, it's about experience. You realize actually Kalam and Falsafa is this, and then, Sufism is that, and you actually find it in Islam. Now, I'm not saying there's a direct lineage, but wallahi, there's an indirect, you cannot deny. And, it's interesting when
I often say it when I read perennial philosophy, and everybody said that, because these are these overlaps. So there is ontology, there's metaphysics in that sense, there is physics, chemistry, everything. On the ontological plane, there are multiple ways of thinking, and maybe at this, if you're only theorizing at the ontological level, that same idea can have different manifestations at different scales. So what really happens is that the text, say for example, Hinduism and Islam, Hinduism is talking about ontological hierarchy as caste. And in this debate of Islam, there is no hierarchy. So even that same ontological overlap in intuition and understanding leads to different societal constructs. So theology is outside the system. The Wahi is the perfect claim of what this system intends to be.
Exactly. So once you understand this reality, then you just cease to have a meaningful relationship with any one particular trend in Islam. And you understand that these trends are, they're all good, alhamdulillah. So the way that I phrase it is that salvational Islam is found in all mainstream trends. And you will enter Jannah regardless of whether you are Sufi, Salafi, Barelvi, even, I'm sorry to be blunt, and they're going to get into a lot of Zaydi, Ibadi, they are practicing Islam enough. They believe in Allah, they believe in the Akhirah. I don't say they're right, please don't misunderstand me. They're foundations of belief in one God and taking the Prophet ﷺ as the perfect role model. And Hisab and Jannah and Nar, that is there. I'm not saying they're all the same, but the beauty, I'm speaking for the critics because I have to always, Allah protect us all, and this is another problem we have, the obsession of wanting to kick people out, the obsession of demonizing, and it goes back to mentalities, and that it's easier to hate on somebody you understand rather than to do the broader picture. So it is what it is. All of this is, the problem comes when you start understanding human psychology and falsafa and whatnot. You'd rather just sit in a room and read rather than interact with the people. You know what I'm saying? This is the problem. But khair, it is what it is. I have to deal with this reality. So my point is that I'm not saying they're all the same. I'm saying that of the barakah of the Prophet ﷺ's message is that pretty much anybody who follows him, insha'Allah ta'ala, they have enough iman and taqwa to enter Jannah if they live up to what their own tradition treats. Now, I'm not saying every tradition, because the guys are going to quote me this group and that group. Yes, you quote me one or two absolute fringe movements. I'm not talking about them. But I firmly believe the bulk of the ummah, like 99% of the ummah, in spite of all of its strands, has what the Prophet ﷺ wanted them to have at a base level. Yes, they could have mistakes. But insha'Allah, if they are pious in their personal lives, their mistakes will be forgiven in light of that piety. Once you understand that I'm no longer obsessed with intra-Muslim disputes, it doesn't concern me. Whether you're this or that, it doesn't bother me as long as a number of things are met. Most importantly, you're concentrating on trying to please Allah, through your understanding of the messengership, your understanding of the process. And secondly, that you're not prioritizing division and hatred of other believers. This is a problem. When your hatred and animosity, rather than the people who are throwing bombs in Gaza, when it goes to those who pray like this, when it goes to those who celebrate or don't celebrate the Mawlid, right? When it goes to those who have a different, ontological concept with the attributes, utterly trivial, utterly petty, right? As you and I think both understand now, the whole, for example, Sifat controversy, it has more to do with the understanding of the philosophy of language than it has to do with the divine. Once you understand that all of this debate should be done by linguists, not by theologians, right? But theologians don't understand that. And theologians quite literally take on the job of linguists. Once you understand this, you just move out of the debate. You're like, I'm no longer interested. The whole sifat controversy to me now takes on a different meaning. I was spiritually invested for 10, 15 years of my life, in the Medina phase. I was spiritually invested, that emotionally invested. You must affirm the attributes in this manner. Once you study the philosophy of language, as I've said in another interview, caused a big backlash, but it's so true. Wittgenstein will solve the sifat in a better manner than almost all of the theologians out there, right? If you follow Wittgenstein, understand where he's coming from. Even the Wittgenstein had no idea of what the sifat controversy was, but his contributions to the philosophy of language will help you understand all of this in a better manner. Once you get to that level, then you are no longer thinking the way that so many other scholars and theologians are thinking.
Anecdote that happened to me. One of, I think, somebody who's interested in philosophy. So he told me, we had a long discussion on philosophy. He told me, Ali, what we need to do is to revive the Unani tradition. And I thought, what is Unani? And then it's Greek. So where is Islam in that? So the Islamization of the Greek tradition in a certain Kalam debate and synthesizing it from the Islamic first principles perspective. So you have a tradition which is already alien to you. So when you say the new Platonic tradition being, conceptually the ingredients of the logic being utilized, but because even that possibility of human construct is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the only thing that we've not been able to do is utilize that framework as Wittgenstein, as Heidegger, as even, say, for example, the postmodern thought. You said that all of these traditions sometimes manifest in other religions. Postmodernity, for that matter, is completely more compatible with Hinduism, multiplicity of truths at a divine level. They are the real ones who could claim that, and that leads to decoloniality in a sense. So we are leveraging into paradigms that might not be suitable in a way to construct our realities. So one related question, Dr. Qadhi, that comes to my mind is about your own correct me if I'm wrong, your PhD is in Ibn Taymiyyah, and in quite a few of your interviews you mentioned that you continue to be Taymiyyah in certain ways.
In certain ways, yes, the key point. Yes.
So what are those certain ways? And what is the Taymiyyan tradition, briefly speaking?
So when I say in certain ways, obviously I just mentioned my position about the Sifat controversy. That's not Taymiyyan. My current position is most definitely not Taymiyyah. He would not appreciate he would not appreciate where I'm coming from in this regard. So when I say Taymiyyah, obviously I'm taking aspects of it. First and foremost, the independence of the spirit and the freedom to be intellectually, like a lot of his admirers and followers do not take into account how intellectually brave he was.
Of course.
To quite literally discard centuries of tradition in the name of real tradition. Like, this is for me the real Taymiyyan bravery. And there are so many fatwa that he has that are considered to be shadh in his time, which are now mainstream, whether they're fiqh, whether they're theological, whatnot. And he felt this is the correct position, what the original Islam or the Salaf would have actually said and whatnot. To me, when the Salafi critics say, "Are you still Salafi?" Of course, not from their perspective. I am Salafi with a small s, meaning I go back to the freedom, the diversity of opinions that existed in the tabi'un, tabi'un, right? If you could go back to 100 Hijrah, and travel the Muslim world and sit in the halaqat and durus, right? You would not recognize anything of intellectual Islam, and you would recognize fully Islam.
Yes.
Do you understand this point here, right? Intellectual Islam, academic Islam would be like, what is this guy talking about? Fiqh, aqidah, tasawwuf, so everything would be radically different. Nothing had yet been...
The conceptual
had not yet been arrived, right? Yeah. And yet you would have recognized Islam completely. Yes. That is the era that I find the most interesting, right? So in that sense, I find myself to be attracted to the Taymiyyan paradigm, is that to be able to think freely.
Islam living without conceptual categories imposed on people.
Exactly.
People experimenting.
Socio-political, the manifestations of what we talked about, the pre-Islamic paradigmatic, epistemologies. Ibn Taymiyyah, even though of course in the end he had to adopt one, and of course you get to the postmodernist phrase, can you truly be unbiased and totally neutral, and of course you can't. So at some level, you're a human, you're fallible, you're going to have to take some template, some reality. But the least biased person is not somebody who's totally unbiased. It's somebody who recognizes more biases that he has. That's the least biased person. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve, and to understand that the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is truly meant to be applied in every time and place, which basically requires a rehaul, a rethinking through, right? While remaining firm to the tradition. This is for me the Taymiyyah paradigm, that you cannot really have Islam without some tradition. It's not as if we are jumping back, bypassing. We respect
the contours of the tradition.
We respect where we came from, but we realize that our path to where we are is not divine. What is divine is the wahi that Allah sent, and the person upon whom it was sent is the paradigmatic manifestation as great as possible of the insan al-kamil. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally. So we've come to the understanding where there's this possibility of people at historical points interpreting and constructing frameworks through which a template or a worldview through which they're interpreting Islam. It has happened in 20th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, that politically speaking, because it's the fall of Khilafah, it's moving back to Ibn Taymiyyah, because Ibn Taymiyyah was the only person at some point of time in history where he thought, because there were invasions, and he thought that there might be that status quo that continues, that might not be relevant in the future, and then he starts questioning, and the taqleed and the gair muqallid debate happens. So in a certain context, I mean, I may be wrong, this is my opinion, and I heard in one of your sessions, and it really elated me that you are thinking along those lines, that the prophetic life, chronologically speaking, has seen multiplicities of political paradigms, also social paradigms, also economic paradigms, all of these layers, but because of the lack of time that we have, political paradigms. So in that sense, what we inherit today as modern Muslims, post-colonial world, is pre-colonial or colonial, it's colonial understandings of where are we leading the Muslim society, politically speaking. There is Iqamat-e-Deen of Maulana Maududi, there is Muttahida Qawmiyat of Hussain Ahmad Madni. Allama Iqbal understanding the federal structure through which we can have pockets of distributed strategies. And then Maulana Azad moving from Khilafat movement to completely secularizing Islam in the constitutional framework. I mean, this kind of diversity in a South Asian context is almost as vast as any other place in the world, even Arabs or Persians. So we have that strong tradition in India also of conceptually reconstructing, re-theorizing, re-understanding. Where did we fail?
So before I even answer that question, I would like our listeners to actually go back to what you said. This is a very beautiful summary of, I think, 6 individuals you mentioned, right? Almost all of them contemporaneous, or at least same epoch and era, right?
Yeah.
Here's the beauty, and this is what I'm, what I say this in other lectures, but not with these particular individuals, is that the diversity of political thought, it is the kernels of it are manifested in the time of the Sahaba themselves.
Yes.
And in fact, we go back to the Seerah epoch, and we see that the Seerah itself can easily be divided into at least 4 or 5 or 6, depending on how you want to look at it, different categories, right? Yes. So look at these 6 individuals you mentioned. If you were to meet them in their private lives, I have no doubt all of them would be praying regularly.
Yes.
All of them have a genuine love of the Quran. All of them have a strong sense of Islamic pride and identity, right? I have no doubt that they would be teaching Islam to their children, and Islam would be easily recognizable in their personal lives. And yet, in their political manifestations of how Islam should be manifested in the realm of society, in the realm of country, look at how diverse all of these voices are, right? We find that same level of diversity, if not more, actually even more in our times. And I am somebody, I've said this multiple times, I welcome this diversity. I am not as arrogant to say only one strand is the correct one. On the contrary, we're dealing with, at the very least, 2 different manifestations, two different intersections. Number one, at the theoretical level, and number two, at the psychological level. Theoretical level, is there a one correct opinion that Islam would say? And I would say, no, there isn't, number one. But many people would say, yes, there is. So if you were to ask Maududi, who without a doubt he is, if you were to ask, Iqbal, he has a very clear, if you were to ask, Maulana Azad, in their opinions, because they're the founders of these trends in their time frame, they are adamant, Islam wants us to do this. And they're certain theoretically. I'm going to even bring it to the psychological level. I'm a firm believer that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created man in a vast spectrum, of different templates, if you like. And in fact, some people are naturally inclined towards one over the other. Some people are more spiritually inclined, others are more academically inclined, others are more politically inclined. And I'm actually a firm believer now that, in fact, Islam caters to all of these things. So there is no, one solution fits all to all of this problem in the first place. Let some people be more politically motivated, good for them. Let others say, yes, not, humko isme khushi nahi milti, humko bas apne baithe ibadat zikr karna hai. Good for you as well. Some people aren't cut out to be political activists, Let others study in the books and become academics. And the beauty of the faith is that it caters to all of these. That's for me the beauty. Now, you ask me what my personal views are in my personal life, then obviously my last 20 years of preaching has demonstrated this, is that I am somebody who is extremely politically engaged in terms of awareness, but not politically engaged in terms of activism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
This is who I am.
You're theorizing polity, but you're not trying to be an activist or politician by growing on the ground.
Not at all. But at the same time, I welcome diversity, and I'm not opposed to anybody as long as certain, guidelines are met. Fi kullin khair, inshallah. And I've said this many times in this regard.
So, Dr. Qadhi, when all of these thinkers were trying to theorize what, politically speaking, Islam ought to be, it was a different context. The world had not divided into nation states. There was a theory of nation states. There was a Westphalian idea. Empires were disintegrating into smaller, sovereign, territorial regions with their own constitutional frameworks. And it is within this that all of these theories dismantled in a way. All of them became almost irrelevant in the sense of the way they theorized that politics to work. So in this nation state order, where in my observation, all of those prophetic periods of different kinds of polities, where you had a Makkan Daur, and then within the Makkan Daur, there are at least a few stages.
Exactly, yeah.
And then in the Madina Daur, there's at least a few stages.
You can go infinite. If you really wanted to, you could divide it into 10 phases.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even further, if you really want to.
Exactly, yeah. That's the beauty of the seerah.
Yes.
It allows for this diversity of thought, which allows different thinkers to tap into different areas and different socio-political circumstances.
Yes. So in this nation-state paradigm, where we're divided at least in 200 nations, within those nations there are micropolities to the level of even your locality.
Exactly, yeah.
We're facing all of the prophetic life all
simultaneously.
the time, simultaneously.
Yep, exactly.
And that leads to the idea of taqleed, gair muqallid and ijtihad in a sense. How do you see all of that? And how do we need to engage with this question of identity in terms of our political identity, so to speak, in a nation-state order that we face? For me, as a student of politics, Makkah and Medina were city-states, and they were micro versions of global nation-states. All of those attributes in a micro sense, for me, exists. How do you see these?
So once again, your questions have a lot to unpack, and we can go many different tangents here. Firstly, let us separate between theory and between reality, right? And this is something that I always like to bring up, because I find all too often that people love to discuss theory and ignore reality. And sometimes people only care about reality and ignore theory. So theoretically, what is ideal? Theoretically, what would be a utopic state? That is something, let's discuss, fine, let's talk about that. And we'd love to discuss that as well. My only caveat or concern, once we discuss that, let us not forget that that theory doesn't actually exist.
Yes.
In fact, whether it ever actually existed after the prophetic years, after the even Khulafa Rashidun, let's just say, okay, Khulafa Rashidun, let's just say even the first half of the Khulafa Rashidun. But the point is, after that theory, what do we do in reality? So these are two separate discussions. Theoretically, there's no question that we would hope and wish that there is a strong polity, an independent Islamic principality, and most importantly, people are free to practice Islam, and the environment is conducive to the flourishing of Islamic morality, Islamic thought, and theoretically, any Muslim would have the right to live in that land. Okay? Now, frankly, has such a land ever existed, post-Umayyad time frame? That's a question, and to what level? That is a question that we can discuss later on, because I'm a bit more cynic in this regard, and I do believe that most people who envision the past haven't actually studied history, and it was never as utopic and as idealistic as people portray. Sure, it's better than the tyrannical regimes that we're facing, but frankly, in terms of individual freedom, was it better than some of the places of our time today? That's a question for debate. That's a separate question, theory. Theory aside, the reality is no Muslim alive today can possibly exist outside of the Westphalian nation-state system. That is reality. The reality is you have a citizenship and I have a citizenship. The reality is we need to deal with the United Nations as a status quo. We need to deal with the human rights. We need to deal with, and even those pockets that are coming up. Let's not mention names, maybe to not get anybody into trouble, but there are a number of, nation states in which Muslim-friendly sentiments have now come forth and taken over. Muslim-friendly, but they're still a part of the UN. They're still a part of the international banking systems. They're still a part of, having to have treaties, peace treaties, concessions with the superpowers, mini superpowers of the region and major superpowers in the world. If people can sympathize and say, okay, they have to give concessions here, they have to give concessions there, you understand, therefore, then politics is a game of concessions, right? So which concessions are the best to give to attain which priorities? It's a fully ijtihadi issue. Bottom line, to summarize my philosophical paradigm, I don't believe that any one narrow-minded, specific interpretation of politics is best for the ummah. I believe a diversity is needed and healthy. And I believe it becomes problematic when people on this diversity don't understand the need for this diversity. I was in Bangladesh. I don't mind saying this because it's a public thing. I was there and I spoke to the people there and I said, you were in a repressive regime where religiosity was criminalized, where people lost their lives for trying to be religious. And you're now in a new era where everybody's coming together and live and let live. Which one is better? Everybody says, of course, currently. I said, in order to maintain this, don't you see that the more realistic solution is to cooperate with all of the groups to have a level of freedom in which might not be Islamic, that level, but it allows you to be Islamic? Is that not better than going back to status quo? This is the bitter reality of lived politics, right? I'm not saying that's ideal. I'm saying, would you rather go to jail and die because you're trying to pray? Or you pray and your neighbor najgan? I'm just being frankly honest here, right? Which one is better for you in the time frame? And the reality, as we all know, you can theorize as much as you want. If you and your family were in that situation, you don't want your kids to go to jail to be without a father. You don't want to be repressed by a regime. You would rather have, and this is our freedoms we enjoy in most Western countries as well, right? By the way, Western countries, we're not even aiming for a khilafah. We're just aiming to protect our constitutional rights. I've said this multiple times. So the lived reality is always going to be different than the theoretical ideal. And inshallah, as long as you understand the goal generically is the same. What is that goal? The preservation of Islam at the individual level. That is the goal. The preservation of Islam at the individual level. As long as everybody understands that, then okay, fi kullin khair.
So, Dr. Qadhi, I want your opinion on this. It's my observation. One of the cornerstones of the Western civilization in terms of constitutional structure is legal pluralism. When I see the prophetic life, and I see even after the dawah, when people said that we don't agree with this, to them their own religion, and there's the only religion theologically who embeds plurality of legalism in a certain fashion with the larger Islamic moral paradigm at the superstructure is only Islam.
Actually, that's very true because the Constitution of Medina of the Prophet ﷺ literally enshrined
Exactly.
political and legal rights to every one of these mini federations.
Yes.
It's in the Constitution
Itself.
that the people of the book, the Jewish tribe, will judge amongst themselves. They'll have their own judges.
Yes.
They'll have their own. And the Quran itself says, let the people of the Torah judge by the Torah. Let the people of the Injil judge by the Injil. So ideally, and of course, this is where we have the simple-minded Muslims. They don't even understand Islam itself guarantees these types of rights. They want a version of Islamic law that even Islamic law does not ask for.
That's
It's the irony here.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, they have a very utopic understanding of Islamic law. When people try to point this out, the pushback is quite harsh and severe. And I've mentioned this in another lecture. In the books of Ahkam Ahl Dhimma, of how to treat Ahl Dhimma, it is mentioned that if a Muslim marries a Christian wife, the Christian wife is allowed to drink alcohol and to worship her own way. And in fact, the Muslim should have a special place in the home. In some books it says this, that where will the, because you have to realize Christian rituals, like the Catholics, they would drink alcohol for their rituals, a little bit of alcohol. So how will the Muslim then, allow a Christian wife to practice her rituals without allowing the alcohol? You see, there's this dichotomy here. If you're married to a Christian and she's going to be doing her rituals, and that involves alcohol, and it involves, worshiping of Jesus Christ, literally, but he's married to her. The books of Ahl Dhimma say that he must allow her access, even though, of course, he should not pollute his own food here. Now, can you imagine this would mean within an Islamic state, alcohol is being produced? Within an Islamic state, alcohol is being sold to the Christians. Within an Islamic state, other rituals are being done that is not Tawheed. It is not upon Tawheed. All of this will be protected by the law and protected at the individual level. So then how about in the modern times? What are we going to do in a modern Islamic polity? So the idea that some people have of an absolute enforcement of a version of morality, it never happened. It never happened. Again, go read the books of history. In every epoch and era, even Muslims would do things and everybody knows where to do them. You cannot micromanage and control the entire society. The goal is overall a society that is conducive of the flourishing of morality, where public indecency is kept to a minimal level. This is really the goal.
So all of this leads back to one of the questions which Hallaq poses while Hallaq in his book, The Impossible State. In this modern context, which we call the nation state, with all of its theoretical institutions, secularism, liberalism, pluralism, multiculturalism, all of that, the argument is that, in a sense, Islam cannot thrive at all in a certain sense of the way Islam intends to be. And that creates a very deeply entrenched dichotomy for a Muslim who wants to live in these contexts and exercise their faith in these contexts. So how do you see the work of Hallaq? Because it's very popular in the sense that a lot of young Muslims take it as the foundational way we should address our interaction with the Western epistemology. And because you came back to Yale, studied in the Western academic framework, you have said in your interviews, the interaction between the epistemology of the West and the epistemology of what Islam intends to be. So what is your take on all of this debate?
So it's been many years since I've read The Impossible State, I think twice. It's a very good book overall. It's necessary reading, food for thought, and again, engage even if you don't like. So I'm not going to be able to quote off the top of my head, but the basic thesis of the book is that the modern, correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while, the modern nation state, its roots, its lineage, and its construct and functions are radically different than that of Islam. And therefore, the notion of having a modern Islamic democracy demarcated by a nation state, a boundary, there's going to be a contradiction, not because the one is inherently superior to the other, but because the lineages of each and the functionalities of each are at odds with one another. At that level, theoretically speaking, I am very sympathetic to that. If that is the basic thesis that you're asking me about, I agree with this and that. So I'm sympathetic to this. How can you have a nation state in which the function of the nation state is really just, internal monitoring of the people, the physical welfare, and not the moral welfare? The nation state is not constructed for the moral welfare of the people. There is no nation state that's prioritizing the moral welfare of the people. Whereas an Islamic polity, an Islamic society, it actually prioritizes the morality of the people. How then do you bring about, and that's why any time where you've had such movements come into power where they try to enforce morality, it always backfires. It always backfires because the people in that nation state are not willing to have that level of morality. So at some level, I'm sympathetic. That having been said, I do remember reading that it's possible you get a level of despair, as you said, reading Hallaq, like it seems hopeless, and that's also not good. So what I have said, and again, I'm more than happy to have conversations and be corrected. This is all theory. Firstly, this is a talk for Muslim majority countries, and Muslim minority countries and Western countries, we always say this, that we are not here to overthrow the system, to establish a khilafah. We're here to preserve our constitutional rights to practice Islam. In Muslim majority countries, in Pakistan, in Morocco, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, what should they be doing? Firstly, let the ulama speak, not me. So I'm speaking theoretically. Secondly, my belief is some progress is better than no progress. Some progress where some moralities are established is better than no moralities. So for example, in a Muslim majority country, if we can limit the sale of alcohol to non-Muslims, I think this is progress. And it is actually the Sharia allows, in Muslim majority countries, if we can curb indecencies, fahisha, right?
Also, just theoretically speaking, Dr. Qadhi, it's a question that I want to ask from you. So even as we said that the politics is not chronological, but also other parts are also not chronological. So maybe politically speaking, you're mature enough, but societally you're not that much. So even that would require a certain level of rewiring.
Yes, and this is the awkward reality where morality has been attempted to be enforced politically in the Muslim world at a high level. It has always resulted in a backlash politically and
especially
morally.
In the Muslim world, because the question
But that's what I'm saying. When people rule in the name of religion, not only is the rule corrupted, the perception of the religion is corrupted as well. And this is very, very dangerous. You are going to harm Islam by ruling in the name of Islam when people, but firstly, it's going to be your interpretation of Islam, because at the end of the day, there's always interpretation. And secondly, so let's be theological and historical. One of the reasons why the Fatimid Caliphate collapsed was because they claimed that their Imam was infallible. And the Imam is clearly not infallible. And the reason why another version of Shi'ism in which the Imam is hidden was allowed to flourish is that you're not dealing with a hidden Imam. So when your very fallible caliph pretends to be infallible, clearly the theology is going to collapse in its entirety. And that's what happened. Whereas when the Imam leaves the picture, then you can construct an alternative reality and believe in it, right? And this is why I think Sunnism, one of the biggest perks and benefits, and of course, generically, I'm of course Sunni in this regard, is that it separated piety from politics from the very beginning after the Khulafa al-Rashidun. And it allowed for that without harming the deen. It allowed and said, you know what, we can have a corrupt ruler and the religion is still the same. The religion is protected. The ruler is corrupt and the ulama will take charge of the religiosity of the folks. This was to me a victory in that you delinked the power base from religious interpretation and authority.
But there could still be, in this paradigm also, a so-called philosopher king and a ulama king.
Theoretically, but I challenge you, when has it ever existed after Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali radiallahu anhu?
I'm just theoretically.
Yeah,
I mean,
theoretically.
It's not denied.
Theoretically, but even the Khulafa al-Rashidun, this gets very sensitive because people are not willing to talk about this frankly. It was only the first half that was actually politically successful. The latter half, people could not live up to that ideal, and things began to happen in their, not as a fault of the people in charge, but the people cannot live to that level of ideal.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Qadhi. It was, I think, for a long time I was hoping to have this podcast with you. I had hoped to have a longer podcast because your scholarship is much wider and much more comprehensive than what we've covered, and I have not done justice to what your whole spectrum of thought is. And what we usually intend in our podcast is to try to capture the essence of the scholar we're dealing with, but because of the lack of time, we have a flight, so we restricted, as rightly suggested by you, to a few areas of your interest, and alhamdulillah, it benefited me a lot, and hopefully it will benefit the audience a lot too, and maybe we can take up these other issues in the future.
Inshallah. Pleasure was mine. I appreciate you coming. May Allah Azza wa Jal bless you in your efforts, and a special dua to all of my brothers and sisters in India. Without a doubt, obviously I have a direct biological and ethnic and intellectual heritage to that land, and there's a lot going on. You're constantly in my thoughts and du'as, and I've given multiple talks about the reality and situation, and I pray that inshallah ta'ala we see brighter times ahead, and that this Islamophobia right now that we see, inshallah, it is eliminated, and the Muslims of India are able to thrive and flourish as their ancestors did in the past, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.